Hello, and welcome to an all-new episode of Talking the Outsider. I am your host, Kinte, all the way live from Los Angeles, California, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. And I'm here with my beautiful, talented co-host, the one and only Jen.
Hey, how is everything going? I'm super excited about Talking the Outsider. This is one of those series that I feel like is such a sleeper in the sense that a lot of people don't know about it, or if they do know about it, they do not know how
California,
good it is.
And I'm so happy to be
you
here
and I
with
to
you
be able to discuss
today.
This is really kind of awesome. There's so much in this series that I definitely want to share. And the pilot episode of this is, I think, one of the best in terms of Stephen King adaptations that I've seen in forever. So I'm really super excited to have a chance to discuss it. And also, something interesting that I was just thinking about, because we had done kind of a recap of the book, something that I just thought about was how incredibly monumentous it must have been to take this on. When I think about how big the idea is behind the what's happening and how they decided to adapt it, I have to say I'm really impressed with a lot of people that are involved in this series, and I've got to give a huge shout out to Jason Bateman, because what vision behind seeing this that he thought was here in terms of potential is it was quite a good foresight for him to have.
Yeah, definitely. Jason Bateman, Richard Price, they have such a great, cast of talent that is, helping out with putting this show on. And I just
think, as executive producer, I just feel like he's got, clearly he saw some good vision in this, and he was right on with it.
Yes. So we're going to definitely talk about that. This is episode 2, because we reviewed the whole book. So just in case you haven't heard, you can go back and listen to our review of the book. We talk about it in a general sense for the first half, and then we warn you when we start going into the spoiler part of the book. So you can, even if you haven't read the book, you can at least listen to the first half of that podcast and find out about the book. Now, we've finished the book, both of us, so we know we're well versed in it. We're not going to spoil you. And some things are not spoilers anyway. So because the book and the TV series definitely is changes up. So let me first start off by talking about, HBO has a great track record of programming, and they have some really good procedural stuff. You have True Detective, you had the Night Of, you have, some really good programs. So when I heard that HBO was in fact going to be the network that was going to carry this material, I got excited. What about you?
Definitely. And, something that I know HBO does is they vet their series fairly extensively before anything even hits the screen. And to sort of, again, this goes back to what I was talking about with Jason Bateman, the idea that they had such a really big sort of involvement from people says to me that there was not just a big hype about it, but that there was some real quality behind what was happening. One thing also that I think HBO allows for us to sort of see and do that other networks or platforms might not do is HBO is never afraid to sort of like take a chance on some things. I mean, as much as, from a financial perspective, they want to make money. Narratively, they are not afraid to take chances in a lot of ways. And I feel like this was one of those. It definitely paid off, but it's interesting because this is very atypical of a lot of series that you will see.
Yeah, it's very, very, very well done. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get into this program. So the book came out in 2018, so this is a quick turnaround. I mean, and his, let's just be honest. I think he has to be the author that has had most, his work made into programming. So,
right.
So clearly, I mean, it's not surprising that a Stephen King novel gets, adapted, right? But I mean, this is pretty quick turnaround.
I want to mention something because I feel like there was an ambiguity here. And so as we sort of set up what's happening inside of the series, this relates to the book, but it also is sort of like what we are seeing on the screen. The book was written to take place in 1989. And that is that as we are seeing things on the screen, it is not that's not very clear to us, I don't think, in terms of what we see in the first pilot. So and it may be that they decided to sort of like move a little bit away from that, but I feel like that's an important sort of aspect to kind of make, because in some ways they rely on gray areas that feel like, why wouldn't they just immediately know? Don't they have a crime and forensic lab and all of that kind of stuff?
Thank you. Yeah, that's something that definitely needed to be said. Okay, so let's talk about who's in this series. Ralph Anderson, who is the main protagonist, is played by the actor Ben Mendelsohn, who's, I believe, Australian, right?
Is he?
Yeah, I believe, he's like an Australian actor. He's definitely not American, for sure. But, so he's the lead. Playing his wife is Mare Winningham, Jeannie Anderson. And Jason Bateman plays Terry Maitland. And his wife is played by Julianne Nicholson. You might remember her from Law and Order: Criminal Intent. She was on there, as well as many other things. She's a fantastic actress. And so those are the main characters. We have Bill Camp, who plays Howard Solomon, and then we have other actors. As we go along, we'll round those out. So, and we're not going to spoil. These episodes will be purely based on these specific episodes. So you can, if you're following along, if you only seen the first episode, you can definitely listen to this podcast. No spoilers about what happens in the future, including the novel. We only will talk about the novel as it relates to the specific episode. So, much like the novel, the series starts off somewhat similar. The novel starts off with they're on their way to arrest Terry Maitland, and they're also talking with the different witnesses. So just to let people know what the synopsis of this episode and the series is: when the body of an 11-year-old boy is found in the Georgia woods, Detective Ralph Anderson launches an investigation into the gruesome murder. Eyewitnesses and physical evidence point to a local teacher and baseball coach, Terry Maitland. The director of this episode is Jason Bateman. The writer is Richard Price. Okay, so it has a flurry of eyewitness testimonies that put Jason Bateman's character, Terry Maitland, at a potential scene of a crime. Well, not a potential scene of a crime, but with the victim, who is Frankie Peterson, the 11-year-old boy. And very quickly, we are told that he is not just the prime suspect, the likely killer, even though we never see him actually doing the deed. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So let's also, because this is such a visual story, and because we have something that I think I've sort of called it gray storytelling, and it's not gray storytelling as in there's an ambiguity to it. It's gray storytelling as in you'll notice that it is shot with a kind of almost gritty feel to it. It's muted. All the colors are very muted. In a lot of ways, it's very dark. There's where we see shadows, the shadows almost feel like they are practically non-existent. There's just such a level of different saturation in the color content of the series. The reason that this is important is because as we're watching what's unfolding, we see there are certain splashes of color that we see that become very important. And one of them is in the very beginning, we see blood on a smear of blood as the man is walking his dog. We see a smear of blood on a white van. And that white van with the smear of blood is basically then that segues into the man and the dog finding the body in the woods. This is one of those sort of instances where the level of visual storytelling in cues is really, it's very pronounced. So where I feel like I can add a little bit of information about what those things are, I definitely will do that as we go. But I feel like that's important because the van is also, that's sort of a big question in the first episode. Where is this van even from?
Yes, and what I'll try to do is, let me pull it up. What I'll try to do is, let me pull up, I'm trying to have visuals to go with what we're talking about when possible. Okay, sorry about that. So, let's see, you said the van, right?
Right. And it features prominently throughout this first episode because all of the eyewitnesses basically put Terry Maitland in this white van. The little girl who testifies or who comes in for the interview, and then the witness who was the shopper also see him in the white van.
Okay, so here, let me start off by giving you guys, if you're watching, you can see this. Obviously, if you're not watching, you will not see this. But there's the van and there's the dog seeing it.
And there we see the blood right on the outside.
All right. So very early on, like I said, we are pushed into this storyline, and we start to get the impression that this Terry Maitland character is a not only a murderer, but one of the worst kind, murderer of a child. And they actually show the dead body of the child, which kind of took me by surprise because I didn't expect to see it,
And it's a messy crime scene. I mean, right. It is just absolutely messy from start to finish. It's in no way can you believe that somebody did this in a way that was meant to hide or cover any of the evidence around. It was just absolutely chaotically messy at the crime scene itself, which is also very important.
Yeah, very much so. So now a big bone of contention when it comes to this storyline is the handling of Terry Maitland's arrest. It is something that is one of the major points of the series. Right. Is how they handled it. So this is him. He was coaching a little league team, and they came to arrest him in front of everybody. So that's one of the big bones of contention. Was this necessary? Could they have handled it another way? What do you think about that decision on the part of Ralph Anderson because this is very much a Ralph Anderson decision?
So, interestingly, it's a small town, and we know that, anybody who's anybody, especially anybody who's got kids, is going to be at the game, either to support their own kids or support their neighbors' kids or whatever. So it was very showy. And the thing that this sets up right away is that Ralph has a chip on his shoulder, a very big chip on his shoulder. And it really feels like this is so personal. It does not feel like this decision was made in some way to further justice or, give us some sense that he's a good cop or anything. It feels incredibly vindictive.
Right. Now, this is the first part where I'm gonna talk about the difference between the novel as well as the TV series. Is in the novel, Ralph Anderson and Jeannie Anderson's son, Derek Anderson, who's around the same age as the victim, Frankie Peterson, or maybe a little bit older, I should say, is away at a camp. So he's very much alive in the novel, even though I think there's a phone conversation in the book, but he's never really there in the novel. On this TV series, they make a big difference. In the TV series, Derek Anderson had died of cancer. I can't remember how long it had been since they've been grieving his loss, but he died of cancer. So they're still in the grieving process of dealing with the fact that their young son has died.
Right.
So the thought for Ralph Anderson that possibly, Terry Maitland, who used to coach his son, possibly might have done something to his kid, because you're thinking this can't be the first time, right? He's done something like this, is definitely clouding his judgment.
Well, I think there's that, and I also think that there is the part of Ralph, series wise, that is my son was taken away from me. How dare you? You just from an absolute moral high point, take away the life of a child if it's not necessary. In other words, like, his grief was so powerful, so all important and all consuming, that he has this huge sense of this is not just that it's not right. Of course, it's never right. But he is carrying this huge weight with him that feels like, my son died, and he died of cancer. But he was still taken away from me. How dare you take something away intentionally from somebody else? Like, that's how it felt to me.
Yes. And like I said, this will keep coming back up during the course of this series. That decision, that fateful decision. Now, one thing is, Marcy Maitland, Terry's wife, she is a rock, right? She, loves her husband. She has 100% belief in his innocence. So, so she's a very outstanding character. And it's some. So
you need to remember that in the series, Marcy's name is Glory.
Right. I'm sorry, they did change it. Glory Maitland.
Yeah. So that because people will get confused.
I'm sorry, series, you guys.
Her name is Glory.
In the book, it's Marcy. I wonder why they changed the name. We'll talk with our next character, and they changed the name slightly. But yeah. So I'm sorry. I got to get used to it. Glory Maitland, the wife. Right.
Right.
So played by Julianne Nicholson. Yeah. Okay. So, and as I said in the review of the book, if you're convicted, or I'm sorry, not convicted, but if you are accused of a crime, it's always helpful to have your best friend be the best attorney money could buy. And we are greeted by how. I got to get used to this one because they changed it as well. It's Howard Solomon. In the book, It's Howard Gold. So I don't know why they changed the name, but they did. So that's that is Glory Maitland. As I got to get used to it, Glory Maitland gets on the phone and calls her, her husband's best friend, attorney, and says what happened, and then he starts giving her, lawyer speech, like, okay, don't say nothing, do this, da. So all of this stuff starts to come in. Also, while they're showing in real time the arrest of Terry Maitland, they're intercutting with the detective work that was done to land that it was him. So we see, and it's very brilliantly edited and shot and done. all the interviews of, the witnesses, and, from young, old to, sketchy people, people who saw something, right? And
what was interesting about those interviews was, and so telling, was the way that Terry Maitland appears to speak to the people or interact with the people that are the witnesses who have seen him in the white van. And one of them is this little girl, and he tells this little girl it's okay to cry, like encouraging her actually to cry. See, it was such an interesting character injection right there. You're right. It was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And this is it right here. The young girl who sees him go into the van, so
he's still got blood all over him. Oh my god!
Right, and
that's really terrifying.
And I believe he says that he cut himself on a branch or something. I can't remember exactly what his excuse was to the girl. And there is a scene where he drives around, and you're like, wait, is he gonna do something to this girl or what? And then he just kind of drives off. So,
but that's where he tells her that it's okay to cry. Yeah.
Yeah. So, which
seems remarkably insidious for a grown-up to tell a kid.
Right.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, cry. Yeah, I make people cry, little girl. So anyway, so so like I said, we're intercut. One of the people that we come across as far as witnesses is a character who's a sketchy character based on his past. He is the bouncer at the Gentleman Please. What is it? Gentleman Please in this? I'm getting confused.
The name of the strip club.
Right. We'll just say the strip club. The strip club. And who is going to factor in as a important character, Claude Bolton. So he talks about his encounter with Terry Maitland, and it's a very weird encounter. And first of all, the fact that Terry Maitland, who's very much a family man and whatnot, was even in the strip club. Remember, he thinks he's lost. Like, hey, are you lost? Right. Like, why are you in here? Because he's not used to. He just wouldn't. He wouldn't seem like a person that would be in this sort of place. So, and as we find out with other people who witnessed him and his behavior, that was very bizarre. But all this stacks up to insurmountable evidence, right?
I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
What did you think about sort of the I'm going to put this in kind of air quotes, insta-guilt that people were ready to believe about Terry Maitland? It's so fascinating to me that nobody really even at least that we saw, stopped to say, well, maybe he's not guilty. I mean, do we really know? What do we actually know about this? It was like they heard that he was the killer, and then that was it. Now in everybody's mind, he's the killer.
Well, one thing I would say is that, a lot of people, if the police say that you did something, you did it. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's people that believe like that. Like, if the law says you did it, you are guilty. You are a scumbag. So I think that's where we're at with that. Is people, they trust the law, and the law says it. And then there's witnesses, and people talk. It's a small town. People are saying what they saw, what they know, or they think they know. So that's how it happens, So it's not a lot of nuance, and people like to believe the worst of people too. It's unfortunate.
That's what I was thinking too. I was thinking, boy, how ready were these people to just sort of all glom onto this idea that even though he was an absolute pillar of the community in terms of being involved in kids and giving his time and all of that that even despite that, they were just ready to sort of crucify him on the spot because, oh my God, he, what a terrible thing. And this is one of the ways that I feel like the show really succeeds. Whereas I'll just make a quick comparison to the book, where the book really sort of narrates for us a lot of what's happening. The show obviously has to tell us a lot through by showing us without having extended dialogue some things, and it really succeeds because there are moments, in especially the pilot episode, where we are led down these paths, and those paths are so revealing that we get an overall sense of what's transpiring without anybody having to tell us exactly what's transpiring.
Yeah, and that's the difference between a novel and a television show. And they made some differences on the show that made great narrative sense for a TV show, I thought, and some of the things that they are including a little bit earlier than the novel, I think it works very well for the program. So so I think it's pretty good. So all right, so during this episode, they all get him in a room, and they start telling him, you're going to fry. Right. Like, we got you dead to rights.
Yep.
We want you to admit what you've done. And obviously, he doesn't, he believes he didn't do it. I don't know any other way to say it, right? So he's like, well, this is crazy, right? And how can you do this to me? How could you arrest me in front of everybody? Why, and Howie Gold is like, couldn't you have talked to my client before you did what you did,
Right.
So,
and I think this is good though, because I feel like this is the kind of stuff that lets not just the kind of person that Ralph is, but it also allows for a little bit of room for some redemption, because ultimately, I think, in terms of when you make a choice like that, I think you always have to be thinking about that, right? You always have to be thinking about, well, what if I made the wrong choice? And clearly for him, he was so convinced that this was the right choice to make that there were no misgivings at all. Like, to do something so publicly, you would have to have such a strong steel resolve that this was absolutely going to turn out exactly the way that you thought it was going to turn out. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah. So, one thing that they do that's somewhat different than a novel is when Terry Maitland is actually in jail, there's this whole piece up where inmates are threatening him, So, inmates are threatening him, threatening his life.
Right.
And, and there's a scene where they're going to put him in the cell with some people who've already threatened him. Because, one of the worst crimes you could commit in a prison situation is murdering a child. So, right. Of course, even the people in prison, they don't support that. So that's something that was definitely added for the TV show is that. Another thing that I think we have to talk about is that, obviously losing your child in any way, but definitely a horrific manner, is one of the worst things that can befall anybody, right? And so the Peterson family, who lost their 11-year-old, son and brother, they are obviously having a very tough time with all of this. And so we get some insight into how they're dealing with it. And the mother, there's this beautiful scene where the mother just loses it and takes a bat and just starts just busting up her own home, you know, and I thought that was very well done, and it just shows, you know, the toll that is put on to this family.
I'm going to interject something sort of from an anecdotal standpoint. I actually lost a child myself, and there is nothing on this planet that even comes close to that kind of grief. It is an absolute sort of all-consuming feeling, and no matter how much time goes by, it's there, that piece is always like super sharp in your mind. And so from a purely empathetic level, there is something so absolutely profound about that scene, because it really encapsulates just the level of grief that these people are feeling. It is not, it's anger that you don't have any way to fix the situation. It's this overwhelming grief, and it is this sense of absolute frustration that there's sort of like nothing in the world that will bring back that peace. And so they're both from, I think, Ralph's point of view and from his mom's point of view, there is just something very powerful about those two things being said right up front in this first episode.
Yeah. Grief is a major part of this series, and how people deal with it, and the effects, and the deafening effects that on a town, on a family, and then our main, you know, protagonist is dealing with grief, you know, before everything even starts. So
Unresolved grief.
Unresolved grief.
Just, yeah, because, you know, sometimes you can actually get to the point where your grief is, it's a part of you. You assimilate it into who you are. But we can clearly see that Ralph has not come to grips with it yet.
Yes. So what ends up happening is it becomes like an arms race of, there becomes this arm race of who's going to get to the evidence first.
Right.
And Howard Solomon hires a guy named Alec Pelly, who's a former detective who's now a private investigator. This is this character right here. And he starts to try to find some exculpatory evidence. And, you know, he's very good at what he does. And, you know, both the police detectives as well as the DA's office are engaged in this kind of battle to try to find out, you know, where's some more evidence, you know, that can go either way. So this episode, and like I said, we're going to go into a lot of details, but when it comes to this TV show, but the Terry Maitland says, I could not have committed this crime because I was in this city called Cap City, which is like 70 miles away. Right. You know, that's his alibi. So now he has to, you know, they have to prove, even though he has witnesses, that he is, you know, there's witnesses. There's 3 teachers that he went on a teachers conference. That's something they changed too. In the novel, they go to see Harlan Coben do a lecture. This one, they changed it to like a teachers conference. And so when Alec Pelly starts looking for any kind of evidence that he was really there in Cap City when this murder happened, he's able to find a video of Terry Maitland at the same time this murder is happening, 70 miles away, asking a question at this conference.
Right.
So that proves that he was somewhere else, not where this murder was happening.
And let's not forget that Ralph is under the impression that Terry, at least in terms of the evidence at first, with the messy crime scene and the not trying to hide anything and everything all being out in public, and that one video of him at the train station where it looks like he's turning to look at the camera, all feels like to Ralph, I think in terms of what he's experiencing, that Terry is somehow saying, "F you," and
Right.
and I feel like that's
Literally.
sort of what, yeah, and I feel like that's sort of what propels him into this, absolute sort of nightmare fuel about proving that, ha ha ha, I got you.
Yeah, literally F you, which is right here. So that's in the surveillance camera footage. So yeah. All right. So I think you know I think we talked enough about what happens in this episode, and we'll obviously go on with more and more. So my question to you is, how do you feel about this first episode? Do you feel like it did an adequate job of getting you into it? Was there enough there for you?
Well, personally, of course, I've got a vested interest in this, and I had from the very moment that I heard that this had been an announced project. But just in terms of what I saw, I have to say one thing quickly about the production values, and this is part of what drew me in. That it is such a it feels like there is always kind of this background noise that's happening, and it's a droning kind of background noise in Outsider, which is very dreadful. It has this almost like a sense of rubbing something raw constantly, and it's interesting that they chose to do this, number one, without much color saturation, and number two, with sort of the backgrounds always being so washed out and dark, because in some ways that might have turned people off. But in this case, it is so instantly compelling because you know that there is something so sinister happening that it almost feels like at all times we are basically maybe not seeing things through the monster's eyes, but we're understanding it from the monster perspective, like, or a supernatural perspective, I should say, because the world is muted, because the world is sort of not the way that it should be. We can see that the world isn't the way it should be. So I think that they did a great job of sort of sucking us in.
Yes, it's definitely sucked me in. So glad that we got this first episode out the way, and the name of the episode was called Fish in a Barrel. We will be covering episode 2, which is called Roanoke, and so I think this is a good start. So let's do this. How can we get you in social media and all that good stuff?
You can find me on Twitter at following Bliss1. You can also check out my websites. CriticalLaughs.com is moving to StudioWhiteWolf.com, and you can always find new recipes at moviesmakethemeal.com.
All right, and you can follow me at Kinte F on Twitter, at Kinte Ferguson on Instagram, and of course the website is indyradio.org. That's INDY radio.org. We'll be back right away with episode 2 of the series. This is episode 3 of our podcast. So,
stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Yeah, thank you. Brain fart. Hey, I'm glad that I brought you along.